right, sounds good. Well, first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this meeting today. If you haven't seen this slide, what I'm showing here is a survey. If you haven't seen this before or haven't had a chance to share your opinion, please take a moment to fill out the survey. I'll also will post a link in the chat right now. Your responses in this survey will help us to understand your VEuPathDB usage and also impact on your work, and will guide us in our future plans. So the survey is anonymous and also doesn't take that long to complete. And if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to us via the contact us link on the main site. Okay, so before I switch it over to David Roos, I just wanted to bring up a few housekeeping items. As you may have noticed, this is a Zoom meeting and not a webinar, so it means that you can interact with us in several ways. First, feel free to post any questions, comments, feedback, or suggestions directly in the chat. And the chat button is located under the chat tab within the Zoom interface. You can also raise hand function, and the hand function is located under the React tab, also within Zoom bar at the bottom. If you on your computer, or sometimes it could be on the side if you're using computer or phone screen. Now, we also welcome you to unmute yourself and speak to us at any point during the presentation. Several staff members will be monitoring Zoom chats and also reactions, so we will see if anybody would like to ask a question, and we'll give you time to speak up and raise any issues, concerns, or questions that you may have. And as I have mentioned, additionally, feel free to unmute yourself. We welcome your suggestions and opinions and don't mind the interruptions. Also, there are additional controls that you may have within Zoom. For example, you can use shortcuts for Windows Alt-Y and for Macs Opт-Y if you would like to raise a hand just using keyboard function. Okay, and with this, I am turning the screen over to David Roos, and we'll stop sharing my slides now.
Hello, everyone. I think you can see my screen.
Yep.
Welcome to everyone to the FungiDB community call. As many of you know, we have run a whole series of outreach activities, from in-person workshops to participation at meetings to webinars and community meetings discussing various aspects of FungiDB and other VEuPathDB databases. And we're certainly happy to continue doing that. Many resources are available online through the help tab. But that's not the purpose of today's meeting. The purpose of today's meeting is to update the fungal community on what the status of these resources are, and answer any questions that you may have. So this slide is just a summary of some background information. It's a little bit wordy, but I want to briefly touch on the 4 points that are mentioned and then suggest some points that we may want to discuss further. The first point is that, as many of you are likely aware, NIH support for FungiDB and the parent VEuPathDB Genomics Resource Program was terminated in the middle of September of 2024. Many of you signed letters in support of FungiDB when that was submitted to NIH last year. In fact, there were several hundred, maybe 500 PIs who signed those support letters for FungiDB, penned by the Fungal Genetics Steering Committee. And the VEuPathDB proposal was, in fact, quite favorably reviewed. For those familiar with the NIH system, we received a score of a 20, which is normally a score that you would take to the bank. But we were surprised to learn in a discussion that with NIH program officers that despite receiving what appears to be the top score of the review panel, NIH has decided to move the BRC program in different directions. And I'm happy to talk about what those look like. This is a decision that met with quite a lot of dismay. Here from the note on the VEuPathDB page when we posted an announcement when we learned that VEuPathDB resources would not be continuing after the middle of September. You may also recall having observed when you tried to navigate to FungiDB in late September that all these resources were offline, and this prompted quite a lot of concern in the popular press, in the scientific press, on social media. And I was personally copied on several thousand emails that was sent to the director of NIH and/or NIAID, including many emails from quite prominent groups or external funders. Nevertheless, this decision appears to be irreversible, and we can talk. There are people who are pursuing further complaints about this in the political realm, but we are not, and we are not because while we will support those efforts, we are not actively engaged in them because we do have a path forward. Concerned about the impact of this NIH decision on biomedical research and global public health in the various areas we support, from mycology to parasitology and vector biology. There are several philanthropic organizations that have stepped up to provide funds that allowed us to bring VEuPathDB resources back online. And we can talk about what that means and what the costs for that are. But we're very grateful to the Foundation for the Advancement of Science and Medicine, Open Philanthropy, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and the University of Pennsylvania and Georgia, which, in addition to providing some funding to backstop efforts, have also agreed to waive indirect costs for the duration of a transition period where we seek to achieve long-term financial sustainability. That means that we were able to bring FungiDB back up online, and it has continued to be reliably available, and we expect that to continue for the foreseeable future, and we can talk about what the foreseeable future means. At present, FungiDB is available as a static resource, which means that all of the new genomes, all of the new functional genomics data, all of the new tools that were in the pipeline for release are currently on hold. And there are reasons for that, because we need to reconstruct infrastructure to make sure that things new data can be loaded and released. That doesn't mean FungiDB is currently out of date, at least not very much out of date. But obviously, with each passing day, with each passing month, the resource becomes less and less useful to the community. We are aware of that. And so while it is possible to maintain existing resources online for a relatively low cost, the cost of continuing to provide new releases is substantially more expensive. Again, something that we can talk about because long-term financial sustainability will depend on receiving additional support. Likely a combination of grants and philanthropic contributions, such as those that the providers listed on the screen have provided already, but also very likely support from the user community. This is sadly an emerging theme in database resources. So as many of you are aware, the funds available for model organism databases such as SGD and Flybase and Wormbase have been declining, and those PIs have been put on notice that community funding is likely to be the need for the future. We, like many on this call, were thrilled to learn that the CGD, the funding for CGD, which has come through a different source at NIH, has recently been renewed, but at far lower levels than that community deserves, in my opinion. And we work closely with other providers at JGI and Ensemble and the SGD, CGD, and PalmBase organism-specific databases to try to ensure that these resources are are synergistic rather than competitive. So my goal today is really to throw things open to questions and to ask people what it is that they would like to hear about. But I have put together a list of possible questions that we're certainly happy to answer. So let me just go through some of those. In kind of, I don't know, chronological order, there may be some interest in more specifics about the NIH review of the VEuPathDB project and what other resources the BRC program is supporting. I think it is fair to say that particularly for the needs of the mycology community, attendees of this call are likely to find those resources inadequate. I'm happy to talk about the size and scale of the FungiDB user base. In fact, maybe I will just do that briefly here to point out that FungiDB is used by something on the order of 5,000 to 6,000 unique users per month, and the average user returns approximately weekly, distributed throughout the globe, particularly in the US and in East Asia and in Europe. Happy to provide statistics from individual countries. Usage of FungiDB resources are relatively limited in Africa, with the exception of Uganda, not surprisingly heavily weighted towards Cryptococcus, and work in South Africa. For other databases supported by VEuPathDB resources, those are linked to areas where diseases occur, interest in the global south in malaria, interest in Mexico and South Asia and East Asia in amoeba. But FungiDB resources are accessed by many thousands of researchers per month. These resources have been cited quite heavily. Those are indicated in turquoise here. And happy to talk more about what the usage of these resources are, and perhaps more importantly about what our plans are for moving forward. I'm happy to talk about the scale of the VEuPathDB budget. Just to give a ballpark estimate, we have operated for the past several years with an operating budget of approximately $6 million per year in direct costs, which has supported a staff of close to 50 people. That's a large group. It's a larger group than academic groups. It's pretty small in the context of the IT sector, generally seeking to provide production resources. And while $6 million is indeed a lot of money, if you divide that by the approximately 50,000 unique users for all of our databases per month, that averages out to a cost of about $100 per person. I can talk about where our funding has come from. I should also mention that the cost of maintaining even a static resource without new releases is on the order of 1/10 that cost, about $600,000 per year. And that's because we run on about $2 million worth of equipment with a lifetime of about 5 years. And even in minimalist mode, we still do need support for systems and database administration, bug fixes, and help for the community. Now, our funding has not.
David, there's a hand up. I don't know if you want to take.
Yeah, thank you,
Xiaorong.
There's a question that you raised. Do you want to raise that now? Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
So the question, I probably missed it. You're talking about 6 million per year. That's just for FungiDB, or it's a VEuPathDB?
No, that's a good question. That question, the $6 million per year is for the larger VEuPathDB project, which includes which includes roughly 5 times the number of users as users of FungiDB. And we have but I should say that the cost of maintaining, we benefit tremendously from economies of scale. As you'll appreciate, the pipelines for, let's say, mapping RNA-seq data and the visualization tools and the analytical tools for querying those databases scale very favorably, so that whatever we develop for Fusarium, the Aspergillus community gets for free, the Plasmodium community gets for free, whatever we develop for Giardia, the fungi community gets for free. So what that means is that the cost of maintaining FungiDB alone without the parasite resources would be substantially more than half of the total cost.
So then my related question is, in terms of, for example, future community support, is this going to be FungiDB collaboration with all other sources within the VEuPathDB, and is going to be a uniform platform, or actually FungiDB is going forward with FungiDB alone to the fungal community?
So that's an open question, and it's something that I've talked about with several of the PIs responsible for the Alliance of Genome Resources that encompasses model organism databases. I have not yet talked to the PIs responsible for SGD and CGD, but have talked with those responsible for flybase and wormbase. And I think everyone is watching with anxious anticipation to see how successful our proposal for community-funded resource will be. There are precedents for this in a variety of different ways, but not quite along the lines of what we have proposed. And I think it is safe to say that I would hope that it is possible to establish a consistent financial model, that there is buy-in from all relevant resources. For example, it would be crazy for you or others to have to contribute separately to FungiDB and SGD and Palmbase and CGD and Microcosm, depending on the nature of their long-term funding, or Ensemble or NCBI resources. The complexity of this is one of the reasons that I think all of us have preferred and would still prefer a single payer model. It makes much more sense for NIH to pay 5,000 investigators to pay me $5 million rather than paying 5,000 or paying 1,000 investigators 5,000 to each pay me $5,000. But where we are currently. So, I mean, I hope
David,
that's
can I clarify something maybe for Xiaorong? Maybe I think the model we're moving on, though, is that FungiDB is part of the VEuPathDB project, and so our funding model is for VEuPathDB and not for FungiDB alone. And so we don't anticipate that FungiDB will go off on its own. I mean, obviously, unless nothing works, but that's we're talking about, a year or two down the road. But for now, it's one project, VEuPathDB, which includes a number of resources with harmonized tools, harmonized methods of data integration, annotation models, and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. But then in that case, I'm wondering, I mean, it will be good to incorporate SGD and CGD and AsperGD. Like, I think that make total sense to me. But then my question is then, would it be better for VEuPathDB to come up with the uniform plan and present to all community? Is that what you guys already have done, or this is a separate?
So we have had those discussions with people. So NIH, so the model organism genome databases have been supported by the NHGRI that supported flybase and wormbase and SGD. And they have been pushing quite strongly for a consistent platform. As you may be aware, the Alliance of Genome Resources, and those resources have been towards a consistent architecture. They have not been required to move to a separate funding model, although Flybase has tried to explore that. And certainly we are very keen to work with those, and we've talked with the program officers who are responsible for the model organism databases at NHGRI, who is very familiar with our model and very supportive of what we're trying to do. But it's obviously not something that we can impose on the organizers of those responsible for SGD. So I think we hear you. As Omar indicates, because of the infrastructure, the consistent infrastructure that we employ and the cost efficacy, we are looking towards a model with a combination of grants and philanthropic contributions, but also user payments for access to FungiDB and all VEuPathDB resources. We can't impose that on SGD or CGD, but we are certainly very open to that model. And I should say that this is also part of a global effort to try to define essential core database resources. There have been two such initiatives. One, the Global Core Biodata Resource, and the other, Elixir. Both of them recognize VEuPathDB as an essential core resource, as they do the Alliance of Genome Resources as well. So I guess in answer to your question, Xiaorong, we agree that that is a sensible model. It is not up to us to impose it unilaterally.
But in terms of VEuPathDB, it is going to be uniform.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Both for FungiDB, ParasiteDB, and those.
That's correct.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is correct. So that does bring us, I'm happy to talk about other possible sources of funding, other people who have funded us. We have been fortunate in the past in also having support from the USDA, the Wellcome Trust, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Burroughs Wellcome Fund. We've been in touch with all of those all of those organizations and more. But all funding agencies are concerned about how to maintain essential core resources, and all of them feel that even if they are in a position to be able to provide some support, it will require a demonstration from the community that they are willing to contribute to these efforts. So that raises the question of whether it is possible to support FungiDB through user fees. And we and others have done some value assessment to try to indicate what this would cost. Let me propose a thought experiment to the whatever 100 plus attendees that we have on the call at the moment. Well over 100 guys, I guess, at the moment. And let me ask you to consider, for example, what the impact would be of FungiDB if FungiDB were to disappear entirely, as it did briefly in September. And I don't know how you measure that impact, whether you measure that impact in terms of reduced number of publications, or the length of time it would take to put out publications, or the cost of hiring additional bioinformatics support from your local resources, or hiring a bioinformatics staff member for your lab. And this is a question that I've asked some of the people who are on this call now. I see in front of me Jay Dunlap and Matt Sachs and Bob Kramer and Sergio Schenkman, an interloper from the parasitology community. And I've probably talked about this with others as well. I'm only seeing those who have their cameras on. And I think it is fair to say that among these and the scores of other investigators that we've talked to, there's a wide range of estimates. Some people feel that the impact of the loss of FungiDB would reduce their productivity by 50%. I think that's an overestimate for almost everyone. Some people think that the impact would be 5%, 10%, 2%. So I'd ask each of you to consider what the impact would be for you individually, and if you fill out our survey that you've provided the link to and will provide in the chat as well, that will ask you to do the same. Secondly, consider what the budget of your research program is. That includes grants, but also salaries and studentships and the cost of your operation. If, for example, the value of FungiDB to your program is 10% of your budget, and you're operating a lab with a $500,000 a year budget, that it follows naturally that the value is $50,000 per year. And I hasten to say, nobody is proposing to charge you $50,000 a year. We know that if we sent you an invoice for $50,000, even if you agreed that that was worthwhile, that would be difficult to impossible for virtually any labs to support. But our estimate is that the cost of maintaining these resources would be something on the order of 1% of lab budget. So for a lab with a budget of $500,000 per year, the cost would be about $5,000 per year. And what we are anticipating doing early in the new year, probably in January, is rolling out what you might think of as an invoice calculator, something like a mortgage calculator if you're buying a house, in which we ask you to privately provide information that we don't collect on the scale of your lab budget, the scale of your program, and some indication of the extent to which people in your group use these resources. We recognize that some people use FungiDB on a daily basis, others monthly or weekly, or not at all. And clearly for a lab for which FungiDB is peripheral to their work, the cost for that should be less than the cost for a lab that relies on where everyone relies on the resource on a daily basis. We will then use that information to provide a recommended assessment of what your fair share of the cost would be. But much as the calculation of tips on a bill at a service provider, it will be up to you to decide what the actual level is. And we will then generate an invoice with using terminology that is focused on fees for data mining and data dissemination. Something else that we hope to be able to help with in response to the requests from NIH and all other funders to ensure that you have an appropriate data sharing plan to make certain that the epigenetic data or the population genetic data or the genome sequence data that your lab provides is accurate. So this touches on many of the questions that are listed here on this list, but we're already half an hour into the call, and so I'd like to shut up and open the floor to questions that I or others in the call will be happy to respond to. Gavin?
Hi, David. I just wanted to give a couple of data points, I guess. So as you know, I used to be the PI of the Aspergillus genome database. We too were funded by NIAID. And when it came up for our second renewal, we were told by NIAID that irrespective of how well we scored, they would not fund the database. So we reached out to the community, and there was like a policy committee that we reached out to who had originally asked us to create the Aspergillus database to apply for funding and create it. And we reached out to them, and we had partnered with a company called Phoenix, which had a model by which they could accept user fees, also get institutional subscriptions, etc. And we asked them, would the Aspergillus community be willing to pay subscription fees that were dependent on the lab size? And they would range between, maybe $500 and a couple of $1,000. And we only were asking for sufficient money to fund 2 full-time people, essentially a programmer, systems administrator, database administrator person, and a curator. And they came back to us a little while later and said that the community was unwilling to pay subscription fee for the database, which I frankly was shocked by, because they had asked us to generate the database in the first place, and I thought it was a fairly modest contribution that we were asking for. We left the database available for 5 years in static mode, so with no additional curation, and it continued to work just fine. But when we moved to the cloud so that we didn't have to pay service support for our machines anymore and worry about things breaking, the Aspergillus genome database simply went away. And so, that resource was lost, but they were unwilling to entertain payment for it. And then, I don't know if you know, but I'm also now PI of SGD.
Yep.
So, our budget has been frozen since 2016, and we've successively laid people off. We're now down to 6 FTEs supported by the SGD grant, and some funds from the Alliance of Genomes and some funds from the Gene Ontology Project. So our scientific advisory board had recommended to us that we provide people a way in which they could donate to SGD, and they were convinced that there were companies who would give money, that larger labs would be interested in providing money. So we put in place a mechanism by which we could accept payment about maybe a year ago, and to date we've received exactly $0.00. So I have to say, while I think your proposals are perfectly reasonable, I'm not sanguine about the likelihood of labs actually being prepared to provide money to support these resources. And in the absence of centralized funding, I think it's going to be very difficult to have such resources. With regards to the Alliance of Genomes, so I'm also one of the PIs on that now, it's clear to me that the NIH wants all of the model organism databases to cease operations at some point in the future. And I think that's in a 5 to 10 year timeline, and that all data from those model organism databases will be served through the Alliance of Genomes interface. And whether it meets the community needs or not is immaterial. They simply don't want to have, mouse genome database, fly genome database, worm genome database, Saccharomyces genome database, each of which, have not insubstantial budgets. Like SGD is maybe like 1.9 million direct a year. And we are by far the smallest. I think Flybase probably has 3 times as many people as us. And they want to have a single thing, which is the Alliance of Genomes, into which maybe additional genomes might be added. I don't think they particularly want to pay for curation, which is the largest amount of SGD's effort. We have, I think, 4 full-time curators, and they see that as a not high enough value activity, even though I think the community thinks it's the highest value activity that they carry out. So sorry to provide some negative comments, but I think that's the reality we're dealing with.
Thanks for that perspective. I can provide a few other comments for the benefit of others on the call, and none of which will surprise you, Gavin. So certainly everything that Gavin says, I would confer with, and we've had extensive discussion with Valentina Di Francesco, the program officer for the Alliance of Genome Resources, and as it happens, our former program officer as well, when she was at NIAID, who is very familiar with all these resources. Valentina has been an ardent champion of the value of genome databases and the importance of central funding. But as Evan says, the writing is on the wall in terms of the ability to sustain these resources. There's been a strong push to encourage the model organism databases, including SGD, to conform to move to a standard architecture in the Alliance of Genome Resources. Those who are not familiar with the Alliance resources will recognize a lot of convergence between the way they and VEuPathDB have independently moved. As for the issue of whether it is possible to support resources through community funding, this is an open question, and we have found that the messaging on this is key. Gavin mentioned having had some discussions with people at Phoenix Biosciences or Biosystems or whatever they call themselves. They do provide support for the Arabidopsis informatics resource, TARE, I'd encourage those of you who are interested in it to take a look at TER resources. NSF supported TER for 15 years and then pulled the plug, decided it was somebody else's turn in the world to step up, and no one did. And TER has successfully made a go of it, moving to a fee-for-service model. It's a minimal fee-for-service model. It provides nowhere near the functionality that is provided by VEuPathDB or the functionality that SGD and other resources seek to provide, but they have been successfully in operation for about 8 years. I was heavily involved in consulting and helping them to get that model set up, and we've been happy to see them successful in that. One of the things that had scared us off was that Stanford had made the determination that remaining on the Stanford campus as a fee-for-service operation would jeopardize their tax-exempt status. And so they've had to move off-site, rent data center space, set up an HR department, rent office space, which is expensive in Menlo Park. But we are fortunate that there are alternative academic models that will allow VEuPathDB to remain on-site. That keeps our costs down. To the point that Evan makes as to whether users are willing to pay for these resources, I've given you an indication of what the what the costs are. We are not willing to erect a paywall for access to services for a variety of reasons, including wanting to ensure that resources remain available to unfunded laboratories that use these resources for teaching purposes, researchers in low-income countries, retirees, and so on. We've explored other tiered models whereby data might only become available for free when it's a year old, or where you would pay more for help services. And we don't feel that those approaches serve the needs of the community very well. So, so the question is, are users willing to do this? And as we have talked to people around the country at various meetings, unfortunately, this was not part of the discussion at the Asilomar meeting, the FTC meeting in Asilomar, because at that point it looked like VEuPathDB would be refunded. But at other meetings that we've recently had, the response has generally been, this is terrible. Is it money? We can send you $1,000, no problem. But $1,000 is not sufficient. If every one of the 50 to 100,000 users in the world who use these resources were to pay us $1,000 a year, that would be great. But there are many people who cannot or will not be able to do that. So our assessment is that something on the order of 0.5% to 1% of lab budget would be your fair share. And this is an experiment to see whether people on this call and elsewhere are willing to have access to these resources. And if not, they will simply disappear. And my suspicion is that that will be true in the not too distant future for other genomic resources, such as model organism databases as well. Omar, I see you have your hand up.
Yep, there are a number of questions coming in the chat. So there's one from Jay Dunlap. Is there any move to begin to integrate FungiDB into the Alliance for Genome Resources databases?
Yeah, so we would be happy. So that is not something that NIHGRI is willing to support, nor NIAID. It's a discussion that we've had with some of the PIs on the Alliance, not yet with Gavin, but certainly we'll be happy to do so. I think their perspective from the standpoint, so NIHGRI has a small-ish budget give to NIAID, and NIAID is not willing to consider this. So certainly the message that we've received from the NIHGRI program officer, Valentina Di Francesco, is that they are eagerly watching to see if this will be successful and might be a model that that would provide support for the broader community. Certainly, there are all kinds of reasons why it would make sense to coordinate more closely. We've tried to coordinate reasonably closely over the past 5 to 10 years with SGD and other alliance members to try to ensure that we have provide consistent kinds of services and don't duplicate effort.
So another question.
Yeah, Jay, I don't know if that if that provides sufficient answer to your question. It's not a yes or no, but like the answer to Xiaorong's question, it's something that we are absolutely open to. We would be delighted to do, but it is not up to us to decide.
Question from Catherine Mayenza. I remember on the survey a question about paying an additional fee on top of a yearly subscription to have full access to new data put on the database. Is this still being considered? And if so, why?
Yeah, so we do not think that that's a viable model for a variety of reasons. First of all, we think it undermines the principles of open data exchange among in the scientific community. In addition, charging and a tiered structure of this would make us ineligible for research grants and would violate the principles of the Global Biodata Coalition and Elixir. So in our assessment, a tiered architecture with data only being available, with providing different services to people who are willing to pay from those who are not, is not a viable option, particularly because it would impact those the most who deserve it the least. Let's say tropical disease researchers working in lower and middle income countries that are disproportionately affected by mycoses and parasitic infections. I see a hand from Rob Kramer.
Hi, David. Thank you. This isn't really a question. It's more a plea to the community to support this resource. Most of us on this call are old enough to remember the days when these types of data sets were becoming available and only the most well-funded laboratories were able to afford access. They were able to pay for bioinformatics analyses, and it gave them a significant advantage in the types of research questions that they could propose and answer. And if we get rid of a resource like this because we're not willing to support it financially as a community, we're going to be right back there. I don't know what everyone's experience on the call was in the month of September when FungiDB went down, but my younger students, they panicked, and they panicked because they've become to rely on the data sets and the ease of use, the ability to generate in silico experiments that VEuPathDB provides. Is that data available elsewhere? Yes, but it does take a certain amount of training and expertise to be able to access it. And it certainly takes a lot of time, even if you have that access. And so FungiDB has made all of that accessible to everybody. And I'd just like to conclude by saying NIH, this is for NIH investigators, you now have to submit a data management plan for every single grant you submit. And you are allowed to ask for money for that data management plan. And so I don't see as a community why we can't be incorporating the costs of maintaining this resource into our funded grants, because NIH is allowing us to budget for it. And so I really just think this is an important resource for our community. We need to do the best we can to maintain this database for as long as we can. It impacts so much of our research in the fungal community and the parasitology community. And, I think what David's proposing is eminently reasonable, and we really need to rally around this and support this. So, thanks.
So there have been some good suggestions here. Let me make a couple of other comments to Rob's comment. Yes, indeed. NIH investigators are required to provide a data sharing plan and are permitted to budget for that. And we will provide language around that, indicating what line items on the budget can be. So we would suggest that moving forward, for whatever resources you use, whether that is FungiDB or other database resources, a budget on the order of bioinformatics support and data dissemination budget on the order of 1% of budget is appropriate. But of course, 1% of a $500,000 budget or a $250,000 budget is still a couple $1,000s that is not available for funding elsewhere. I would guess, and Rob seems to indicate, that for the students in his lab, even being down for a few weeks was probably worth a couple $1,000. But our goal here is not to charge what the service is worth, but what it costs to maintain. I see there are other questions up. Omar, were you going to take a look at those? I have the chat.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm going to go through them. So one question from Vasilis from Ponas. Many thanks for the presentation and for clearly stating the difficulties of sustaining these useful resources. Is crowdsourcing curation, i.e. by volunteer curators, an option? Some solutions could be in software maintenance. And what I would highlight is David, you may want to highlight the user comment system and Apollo, yeah, but also the difficulties in what happens after that crowdsourced annotation is in a database. How do you integrate it into the official annotation and so forth? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say my answer to that is yes and no, and I'd invite to Gavin to also comment if he would like. So curation is expensive. There are a couple of approaches that one can take. As many on this call know, we have run a user comments campaign for years that has captured tens of thousands of comments from the user community about individual genes, links to key publications, indications of experimental phenotypes of knockouts, curatorial comments on aliases and other names for the same gene. Those have been hugely useful. They're immediately text indexed so that they become available, and we will continue to support that. There are also many opportunities to improve annotation opportunities, including crowdsourced activities that can be QC'd by using a variety of machine learning approaches. And I'm sure SGD are exploring strategies in those directions. But it is also true that there are real values to what professional curators can provide that amateurs, and I include myself in that, cannot provide. So there is a huge value to curated annotation in ways that I think are unlikely to be substituted by the efforts of undergraduates as well. I see some other questions about whether
so David, the next question is from Matt Sachs. Are you reading that one?
I am. I'm looking at Matt's, but let me just also comment on the comment from Xiaorong about whether it could help to have undergraduates do this. So the individuals working on the VEuPathDB project, the staff on this project, include no students and postdocs. We have worked with students and postdocs to develop new technologies and implement them and apply them. But there are two reasons we don't hire students and postdocs. One is that students and postdocs don't write production level code, and we rely on being up and accessible and reliable at 99% or better. Secondly, it's exploitative to do so. Right? We will shortly be rolling out a new release of the OrthoMCL database for ortholog detection. And I can't very well go to somebody who wrote the code for that years ago and ask them to update and maintain that code. And I certainly can't go to a student or a postdoc and tell them that they need to put their graduation plans on hold because we need to work on something else that is a critical need for the Aspergillus community or others. I also see Matt's suggestion of whether the subscription model corporate contributions can be tax deductible and whether those could provide additional benefits. That's something that we're exploring. We've been asked on many occasions whether corporations could take a version of the database in-house to avoid working on the insecure open net. It clearly would not be. It would be something that Merck is not eager to have people be able to look at what the genes are that they explore. And with our new architecture in which our code base is largely containerized, that is something that we could potentially do. So there are certainly opportunities for corporate donors, both in the philanthropic space, including some of those who've provided us with funding so far, and from the standpoint of being able to bring a private version of the database in-house to run on their own machines. Our suspicion is that will not be sufficient to keep these resources afloat. I don't think that there is any, I would guess that Novozyme, for example, would be willing to contribute something for access, more than, say, what your lab's fair share might be, Matt. But I doubt Novozyme is going to give us $5 million a year. Xiaorong?
I just want to clarify, I was not saying that you should hire graduate student and undergraduate student to do most of the important job. It's more like curation, annotation of genes, and maybe feeding through the new data to the system. Because I think those are the stuff that undergraduate student can do. And I still remember when I was in Texas A&M, they basically every year is mentoring undergraduate student how to curate the genes and their functions for the E. coli database. And since I think there is a large base, and for example, in University of Georgia and in Pennsylvania, and then those have large undergraduate body, this could be something that they can do as class project, for example, and then that can continue to be supported in that way. I mean, this is just for lowering the cost, but I do think it is important to have subscription. And I like the idea to have the subscription fees based on how frequent the lab use it and how well they found it, and based on that.
Yeah, thank you, Xiaorong, and you're right. I do think that we have pursued community curation projects using undergraduates. There have actually been R03 grants that have been funded in the past to support those kind of things, typically for targeted projects for annotating the genome of species X. And that's something that we have been and are continue to be happy to try to support. But I think the challenge of community curation is difficult. I know, Gavin, I'd given you said I would ask if you wanted to add something. I see that you've added a note in the chat, and which people can read with SGD's experience with a community curation system. I don't know if there's anything further that you wanted to add. So people can read that in the chat. Let me also just return to the comments here. Scott Kane made a helpful comment. As Scott has been involved in the Alliance of Genome Resources, and he is also involved in putting resources together for the future of the NIAID Bioinformatics Resource Center program, and I'm sure he would pipe up if there were reason to disagree with my characterization of that. I'll just read briefly from Scott's chat saying that moving to the Alliance of Genome Resources has been a lot of work. It took over a year to incorporate 2 Xenopus genomes, involving people both at AGR and ZenBase working on it. So I think that a full, and that has been our experience as well. 5 years ago, the VEuPathDB database resource, which has supported FungiDB as well as parasite databases, merged with the database responsible for arthropod disease vectors, mosquitoes and ticks and so on. And that took about a year's worth of effort. Similarly, the bacterial and viral BRCs moved. That took about a year's worth of effort. It took probably 6 months worth of effort to be able to capture all of the information that was represented in AskGD when FungiDB took on responsibility for that. So I think the prospect of simply merging AGR and VEuPathDB is something that is not likely to happen. It would be a huge technical challenge, but I do think that moving towards greater interoperability is essential for the future, and I'm sure that that's something that's recognized by all PIs that are involved. Realize we are coming up to the top of the hour now, and there are people who are going to have to leave at 11 o'clock. Are there other questions? People who'd like to raise hands, type them into the chat, unmute yourself and speak up. So the current plan for, so Claudia Zirion Martinez asked me, can you summarize the current plan for trying to get funding? Yes. So we put together, thank you for raising it. So we put together a 2-year plan for moving to a financially sustainable model that involved community support. And in that plan, that involved a budget of $3 million a year for 2 years. That is less than half of our current budget, but I am glad to report that the funders that I've mentioned have stepped up to provide that funding for the first year. We need a second year of funding as well, and we've been speaking with traditional funding agencies such as the Wellcome Trust and the Burroughs Wellcome Fund, and others, as well as those who have provided funding to date. And we are optimistic that that will be possible, but no one is going to provide that kind of money moving forward. And so our plan for moving forward is to continue to apply for research grants in support of new technological changes, some of which are highlighted on this slide that I won't go through in detail, including AI-based methods to facilitate curation and QC of user data sets, and new technologies that allow users to be able to process their own data sets through our pipelines and integrate those into FungiDB. But the largest piece of this is likely to be from community support. If users, including the people on this call, are not willing to pay for these resources, sadly, they will disappear. Like Gavin, I personally think that if you assess this directly, you will find that the cost efficacy is substantial, but that's not my my decision to make. So our expectation is that in January, we will post a calculator that would allow you to calculate what your fair share of services would be to ensure that these resources remain available to your lab and to the rest of the global community, and that those fees would be applicable worldwide, not just to investigators in the US who has footed the bill for the VEuPathDB project for 20 years or more. And
that goes to Sergio's comment as well about possible international funding from various from foreign countries and so forth.
Yes. So I see a comment from Sergio Schenkman about it was a parasitology researcher in Brazil, and we are open to discussing institutional or funder-based subscriptions on the part of individual laboratories. But my message to the people on this call is that that you consider the impact on your program and whether it is worth it to you to pay on the order of 1% plus or minus of your budget to ensure that those resources are available. And I will point out that tying this to the scale of lab budget makes sense technically, because that is approximately proportional to the usage of the database and data that is disseminated, and also because it scales favorably. So labs with a $0 budget, well, 1% of 0 is still $0. So this applies appropriately Cryptococcus researchers in Uganda or Aspergillus researchers in Korea. We
Okay.
are a couple of minutes past the top of the hour, so I will just mention that this is not the end of the conversation. This is just the beginning of the conversation. And we encourage anyone to click on the Contact Us link on FungiDB for any questions that you may have about this or other topics that you would like to raise. And we will keep the community posted. We will also be rejuvenating our organism community meetings moving forward. For reasons that remain unclear to me, NIAID forced us to shut down our advisory board and our community meetings 5 years ago. I don't understand why, but one of the benefits to no longer being funded through the BRC program is that we are free to continue to solicit input from the community as we think is essential for the future of this project. All right, with that, I will bring this meeting to a close. I will stay online for if people have other comments or questions they want to ask, but I think this is the end of the formal meeting, and why don't we stop recording? We will post the recording online for those who have not been able to attend the meeting.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.